But before we do much else, President Lula gave an address last week for May Day. Increasingly the focus on this show, there's obviously the global dimension, the consciousness dimension, the theory dimension. I keep saying it. We focused unapologetically on Bernie Sanders' campaign because that was singularly important, and he was a singularly good leader, frankly. Now, the only path forward that I see, and I think overall this is usually the case, mass labor movement, mass organizing. We're going to do a lot more shows and talks with people like Dino, Dustin Guastella, and others like him who are actually working in labor strategy. Specifically, labor is the foundation. That's the only way. That's the only countervailing strategic force. And there's a really, really deep moral imagination in that. And Lula really is singularly important as a leader. I'm so proud also of the work that we did and how clear we were on his political imprisonment so early on. Brazil is in deep crisis. You could talk about it. We could, watch the conversation I had last week with Brian Mayer and follow Brazil Wire and other places to keep track of that. Corona is exploding. The military is eyeing things. Bolsonaro is, of course, a deep practitioner like Trump and Modi and Netanyahu and Putin and Duterte and all of these folks of basically necropolitics. And of course, the coup regime in Bolivia. Lula still stands for something that is just fundamentally countervailing. And I thought this talk from his quarantine was very inspiring. We're going to play pretty much all of it. Mm-hmm. This was translated for us by our friend Brian Mayer. Of course, follow all of his work at Telesur and Brazil Wire. This is President Lula May Day address just a couple of days ago from his home in São Paulo.
Minhas amigas e meus amigos, trabalhadores e trabalhadoras do Brasil e do mundo, quero começar a minha fala prestando solidariedade aos familiares de todas as vítimas do coronavírus e a todos os trabalhadores e trabalhadoras que estão lutando para salvar vidas em todo o mundo. Um vírus desconhecido conseguiu fechar as fronteiras, trancar em cada mais de 3 bilhões de seres humanos e mudar de maneira dramática a vida de cada um de nós. Há 3 meses estamos com um longo túnel sem fim, recebendo a cada dia notícias piores que as do dia anterior. A humanidade desperta todos os dias, torcendo para que o número de mortes de hoje seja menor que o de ontem. Estamos vivendo os mais tenebrosos dias da nossa história. O vírus que ataca todos indistintamente mostrou que a raça humana não é imortal e pode até desaparecer. A história nos ensina, porém, que grandes tragédias costumam ser parteira de grandes transformações. O que nós esperamos, o que eu espero, é que o mundo que virá depois do coronavírus seja uma comunidade universal, em que o homem e a mulher, em harmonia com a natureza, seja o centro de tudo, e que a economia e a tecnologia estejam a serviço deles e não o contrário, como aconteceu até hoje. No mundo que eu espero, depois da tragédia do coronavírus, o coletivo haverá de triunfar sobre o individual. A solidariedade e a generosidade triunfarão sobre o lucro. Um mundo em que ninguém explora o trabalho de ninguém. Um mundo em que se respeita as diferenças entre um e o outro. Um mundo em que todos, absolutamente todos, dispõem de ferramentas para se emancipar de qualquer tipo de dominação ou de controle. Mas as grandes tragédias também são reveladoras do verdadeiro caráter das pessoas e das coisas. Não me refiro apenas ao deboche do presidente da República com a memória de mais de 5 mil brasileiros mortos pelo Covid. A pandemia deixou o capitalismo nu. Foram necessários 300 mil cadáveres para a humanidade ver uma verdade que nós trabalhadores conhecemos desde o dia em que nascemos. A tragédia do coronavírus expôs à luz do sol uma verdade inquestionável. o que sustenta o capitalismo não é o capital. Somos nós, os trabalhadores. É essa verdade, nossa velha conhecida, que está levando os principais jornais econômicos do mundo, a Bíblia da elite mundial, a anunciarem que o capitalismo está com os dias contados. Está mesmo, está moribundo. Está nas nossas mãos, nas mãos dos trabalhadores, a tarefa de construir esse novo mundo que vem aí. O Brasil sempre foi uma terra de esperança. Apesar das extremas dificuldades, nós que nascemos e vivemos aqui, soubemos enfrentá-las e soubemos nos reinventar para crescer. O ódio e a ignorância se alimentam um do outro e são o oposto do que vai na alma brasileira. Como brasileiro, tenho a certeza que sairemos dessa tragédia para um mundo melhor, para um Brasil melhor. E é agora, em plena tempestade, que os brasileiros revelam o que são, o que somos: generosos, tolerantes, solidários. E é com esse espírito, essa alegria e essa criatividade que estamos todos lutando para sair das trevas e fazer chegar o mais depressa possível o amanhecer da justiça social e da igualdade e da liberdade. Espero que a tragédia do coronavírus seja a parteira do verdadeiro mundo novo que sonhamos. Viva o povo trabalhador! Viva o 1º de maio!
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, man, that's it. And that really incredible synthesis that we have to figure out. There does need to be transnational labor organizing. There does need to be a new internationalism, but there also needs to be a profound respect for people's desire for sovereignty and their own relationships with their own democratic states right now. And those struggles need to be synthesized. I've talked about global interdependence, national social democracies, and local anti-fragility. That's part of it. And I think that the way he's putting together that universal consciousness of workers with also the individual crisis of Brazil, dealing with this obscene leader, dealing with this, ravaging of this crisis ripping through the country as a result of these barbarous policies pushed through by the Washington Consensus in the form of Bolsonaro. Incredible synthesis too. It speaks to, again, that relationship between the local struggles, that we don't parachute in with an agenda. We listen to people's local, specific circumstances, conditions, aspirations, ideas, practices, and who they are. You don't come in with a mindset to inject into people. And then on the other hand, from a place of really listening, then you can build out the bonds of a common shared interest and vision. Very few politicians, if any, communicate that as well as Lula does. I mean, and it is significant that he is a working class global statesman and leader.
I think so too. I just wanted to add about, this picture of understanding the development of working class consciousness and the nation, right, and the nation state. Look, there is a kind of, there's a right-wing nationalism, obviously. There's a bourgeois nationalism, but it's very important that we don't, give all of that territory away to the right and to the bourgeoisie, especially when we're talking about anti-imperialist struggles, right? It is important to have a kind of Brazilian consciousness, for example, against an international financial community that is trying to tear those people down. The Samir Amin, who was this week's theory reading on the Communist Manifesto, actually has a pretty long section in the reading that I highly suggest people check out if they haven't, where he talks about what he calls the progressive nationalism, which is essentially anti-imperialist and anti-colonial, right? And, it rejects a global centralized order that, is dominated by the United States. So, it's just something that, we should definitely have in our arsenal and not just sort of give up and run away at the word of understanding a kind of national consciousness, because especially for people coming from nations that have been heavily colonized, it's an important first step in developing a political culture.
I mean, I couldn't agree with that more. And I also think that we need to, again, it's another thing that we need to be real about, both in terms of present economic conditions and also understanding these trajectories, because it's one thing to recognize that capital was able to globalize itself. And not only was labor not able to globalize itself in the same way, it was the way capital globalized itself was antithetical to labor's aspirations. But we don't want to, it kind of reminds me of Touré Reed, actually, where if the culturalist explanation inevitably leads in reactionary directions. So we don't want to just come up with an alternative culturalist explanation. And so we don't want to just come up with this sort of alternative post-national globalized demand. Mm-hmm. We actually have to recognize that the nation state is, first of all, it's a site of enormous objective power. And secondly, it's also the only prayer of a countervailing force to transnational capital. And that also most people in this present moment, and also that most people, that is how they constitute themselves. And actually, in some ways, constituting themselves that way is certainly better than some alternatives, and also is not innately reactionary at all. And I think, again, we need to just make sure we don't have time to fall into any traps of subcultural bullshit where we make sweeping and alienating sort of claims and comments about things that like vast majorities identify with. And by the way, some of the way they might identify with is, and we have to build on, is in no way antithetical to building global worker solidarity and genuine bottom-up internationalism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's recognizing you're part of a global, system of solidarity, recognizing, like, as Lula said there, it's like, what coronavirus made clear to everybody,
right,
that, it is the workers that make capitalism function. It's not capital itself.
Right.
That's a universal consciousness, which is an important part of our project as well. I mean, it's fundamentally, it's just like how political power is mediated, in the sense that, like, if you live in a society and you're supposed to be in a democracy, if you elect people to office, they should be able to operate within the full bounds of that mandate. And the current system doesn't allow many countries to operate in that sense at all, right? Their international capital has a veto power over most nations.
And even most interests inside most nations,
yes,
because even people inside the center, there isn't, I mean, yes, we know Lenin's work on the sort of like privileged working class in the centers versus the peripheries. And there was more truth of that in different eras. I mean, the last 40 years has been actually a steady decline of everybody. And then relative improvements in places of absolute abject deprivation and poverty. And then that actually opens up some really interesting different conversations. Like, is it really helping somebody, as an example, to, as any orthodox development theory would say, it's like, oh, well, let's go destroy this traditional community and bring them into the industrial economy.
Yeah.
That's something else that we're going to have to question, not only from the perspective of like the rights of First Nations people, but also as an actual question. Is it always a better thing? I would say no. But
it also strikes me that, like, the way Lula's talking, he's sort of talking about like how a New Dealer might talk about something at the launching of the Tennessee Valley Authority, right? Like building, we have to build the world again. It's like, it's that time, basically. Mm-hmm. We're thrown into that time, and we have to meet it. It's not like we made it happen. Capitalism sort of made it happen, and now it's just time to try to build something out of the wreckage.
And that building is going to take place again in all three of those spheres of global institutions and global cooperation and global labor, for global worker consciousness, for ecological policies, for coordinating on arms control, on pandemics, and so on. And then also, powerful, strong democratic states that deliver health insurance programs to people, that build that, and local systems that we've talked about in terms of resiliency, particularly around food and energy. There's a great new piece in the Jacobin that says, if you want to do a Green New Deal, then you better fight to protect the Tennessee Valley Authority. And that's absolutely true. And it's also like, that's historical consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
That that even these things that we need to do, like a global Green New Deal, are still they're gonna be built on these real physical accomplishments that came before. And they're gonna, transcend and include them.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.